field day for the heat down there. 1,000 people in the street singing songs and they carrying signs, mostly saying hooray for our side. There's battle lines being drawn. Nobody's right if everybody wrong. Young people sweet in their mind, getting so much resistance from behind. We got to stop the children, what's that sound? Everybody looks, it's going down.
So we have a situation in LA County, and this segues into what I want to talk to you about, Jenny, where they are going to voting by mail. It is, going to reduce the turnout. I guarantee you it is going to reduce the turnout. Despite
vote by mail will reduce the turnout?
I do think so. I do think so, because people are not opening their freaking mail.
In general, I think it's supposed to increase turnout, but I have not seen the statistics on it. That's sort of what everybody assumes, but oftentimes assumptions are not correct, as you know, so.
Well, why don't you talk about, because everybody's saying in a pandemic, it is so dangerous to vote, and it is true. We saw an uptick in Wisconsin after that Republican, head of the Senate made them go ahead. The Democratic Party didn't want to do it. The Democratic governor stopped it. The Republican head of the Senate sued because he wanted that Republican Supreme Court guy to get reelected. And then you had all these outbreaks after that. And I even had a reporter on the ground covering that, and people were not wearing masks and they were not social distancing. So I can see why you want to do it, but tell us what the problems are with voting by mail.
Well, sure. I mean, first, I think actually, if I can tell you what the pros are of vote by mail. I mean, number one is in a pandemic, right? You don't have to deal with other voters, which is important, I think, first, especially for people who have compromised immune systems or people at home with compromised immune systems. You don't have to deal with voter suppression. So we've seen a lot of, in particular, closed polling places. In Kentucky right now, in their largest county, which leans Democratic, Jefferson County, there is one of the election officials or a group of election officials want to go from 200 polling places to one, which will create massive lines. So you don't have to deal with that with vote by mail, which is maybe one of the biggest benefits. You do get a hand-marked paper ballot, so you don't have this machine-marked paper crap that people don't double check and the machine can do whatever it wants and no one will notice. So you avoid the touchscreen voting machines, these ballot marking devices. You avoid electronic poll books, which I think are a huge new vulnerability that have not received nearly enough attention because they facilitate or they enable really early voting, which many people are passionate about. And I understand that, but unfortunately, they often are connecting to the internet, which means they can not work, crash, and create massive lines, which is exactly what happened in Los Angeles County. And so you avoid that problem. This will be a big problem in November. The electronic poll books will be a problem nationally. Many, many jurisdictions have ramped up their use of them since 2015. You avoid wireless modems and precinct scanners, which is something else I talk about a lot. ES&S, America's largest vendor, put wireless modems in its precinct-based ballot scanners beginning in 2015 in swing states, and those connect to the internet and are a huge security problem. So those are the main benefits I see, and increased access. It's just easier. Those are the pros of vote by mail. But what gets less attention, I think, at least among Democrats, are some of the dangers of vote by mail, and those are real too. And the number one danger that has me very concerned about vote by mail, and that does not get much attention, it's not so much ballot harvesting, although that's a concern. The greatest concern is that thousands of voters won't receive their mail ballots in the mail. They'll apply for them and they just won't get them. And this happens in every election. It happened before the pandemic. It happened in Los Angeles County. 17,000 voters in Los Angeles County alone did not get their mail ballots on time or at all. But so they had to go to those vote centers if they wanted to vote. In Queensland, Australia recently, which I realize is not the United States, but 500,000 people did not receive their mail ballots in the mail. Half 500,000 people. That could easily happen in the United States, and there's really no remedy for that. It was a big problem in South Florida in 2018, and there were questions as to whether that might have actually swung some of those elections, and it happened in Brexit too, with voters not receiving them. So that's my number one concern. The other problem with vote by mail is that your zip code is on the outside of the envelope, which gives election insiders a lot of information about voters, including oftentimes whether they are more likely to vote Democratic or Republican. And this can be a problem when it comes to things like signature verification, especially if you're farming out to third-party vendors, the signature verification process, but it really can even be done inside. If someone knows, that you're coming from a predominantly blue or predominantly red area of the state, they can have sort of a bias toward whether they're going to put your ballot in the questionable signature pile or just give it a pass and say this ballot's good. And the same is even true if you're using signature verification software, which I think some of the large vote by mail centers apparently do. They can dial up the degree of exactitude that they require for a signature to get a pass or a fail. And so again, that's based on zip codes. Also, with zip codes on these mail ballots, there's a danger of insiders adding stray marks to ballots from certain zip codes if they think that those voters are more like spoil a ballot, basically. And this is before they're cast, right? So that it will get rejected by the scanner. You just fill in an extra bubble or you make some stray marks.
Yeah, I want to ask you about those stray marks because
Sure.
Didn't you tell me that was a problem when you were looking at the recount? There were these extra ticks. They were counted as overvotes.
That's actually where all the errors are coming from. And it's another reason why it's a heightened concern with everybody now getting vote by mail ballots, because all the errors we found in this partial recount process were basically votes that a human being could clearly interpret the voter intent as either a yes or a no. Clearly one circle was filled in and there was just some extraneous mark on the other circle. And so the machine was reading that as both a yes and a no vote and throwing it out as an overvote.
Right. And so the thing is with vote by mail, that's going to happen with in-person voting. This is a benefit of in-person voting, actually. Most current scanners that you buy can tell you if there's a stray mark that's going to it'll tell you right away that there's a stray mark that's causing it to get spit out or an undervote. More of a problem with vote by mail than voting in person. You also have a problem with voters making mistakes when they mail in their ballots. A large portion of vote by mail ballots don't get counted because the voters didn't sign them, or in jurisdictions they might ask for your date of birth and a voter thinks, well, that's none of their business and shouldn't matter, so they don't put it on there. Well, guess what? Grounds to have your ballot tossed. Sometimes married couples will stick both of their ballots into the same envelope, also can get your ballot tossed. Vote selling and coercion is a big problem, I don't know how rampant it is, but it is a concern with vote by mail because you can prove now how you voted, whereas you can't really sell your vote if you're going to vote in person because you can't prove how you voted afterwards. With vote by mail, you can show your ballot to somebody and sell your vote. You can also have like an abusive husband or employer who wants to see your ballot before you mail it in to make sure that you vote a certain way. People don't realize, they think vote by mail means that there's no electronics involved, which is not true. There still are these electronic scanners used to actually count the ballots. At least they are hand-marked ballots. But guess what? This vendor that I've been sort of following all over the country, ES&S, is apparently also the number one. I have heard that they are really benefiting from this new surge toward vote by mail. They're selling a ton of these massive scanners to count the vote by mail ballots. And we don't conduct robust manual audits for the most part in the United States. Believe it or not, 1% in California is better than a lot of places. And it's a scandal. These are robust manual audits. So we still have electronics. The tracking software, something new that I learned, which is actually really kind of scary. Everyone says, well, it's great as long as you have the tracking software. But number one, I haven't heard an answer to this, but I have a question whether tracking software can be hacked. I assume the answer is yes, to tell you that your vote counted when it didn't. But putting that aside, they use a barcode for the tracking software, and the barcode says on the outside of the envelope who you are, which means people can see exactly if you're a registered Democrat or a registered Republican and proceed accordingly when they're looking at your signature or just deciding to lose a bunch of ballots, garbage can. I think it's easier to find and lose boxes of ballots with vote by mail, ballot harvesting, no poll tapes or ballot images. I think those are real problems. Poll tapes are the voting machine tapes generated by the precinct-based equipment at the end of voting. And unfortunately, it seems like election officials don't make much use of those, but election integrity advocates have been doing so more and more. And what you can do is you compare that to the precinct totals to the reported totals, and make sure that what's reported at the precinct, actually, all those votes actually make their way to the official reported totals. And it's actually that type of comparison has provided probably the strongest evidence that we've had to date of possible manipulation of voting machines to disenfranchise Black voters in Shelby County, Tennessee, and also in the Georgia lieutenant governor's race. And so you sort of lose the benefit of this extra piece that the election integrity advocates can use. You lose that with vote by mail. So those are some of the concerns I have. I think overall where I've come down on it is that in-person voting, if you're just talking about security, not the access component, but in-person is probably the best if your polling place uses hand-marked paper ballots, which about 70 to 80% of the country does use. But in addition to paper voter lists instead of electronic poll books, at least on election day, and scanners without wireless modems. So you don't want to have wireless modems in there. If you have all of those things, you're also likely not to live in a serious voter suppression state. And I would say it's more secure to be in person, but by mail is probably the best option if your polling place uses touch screens as a primary voting system at the polls, uses electronic poll books, or uses scanners with wireless modems.
Well, isn't that going to be just a total waste of $300 million and 10 years on all these machines if we do, because you just described LA County, electronic poll books.
Oh, right. Yes. No, electronic poll books is sort of the poster child of everything not to do.
Now, let me ask you this. So Darrell Issa, who's a Republican congressional candidate down in San Diego, he is actually sued to block California's move for all vote by mail. And Judicial Watch, which is a conservative group, is behind that. And they're saying it violates election provisions of the Constitution and represents an, quote, unlawful attempt to supersede and replace California election law by creating an entirely new system that does not conform with an existing state law, the Voters' Choice Act, which lays out requirements for counties that wish to mail ballots to all voters. It warns that election results could be invalidated, specifically citing the 50th district contest in which Issa is the Republican nominee, and the complaint charges that Newsom's order has scrambled Issa's campaign by compelling him to, quote, reevaluate his election strategy and increasing the cost of running a campaign. Issa registered to run for office based under the electoral system established by the California legislature, the complaint says. Now he must develop a new strategy. And Padilla, California's Secretary of State, fired back that the lawsuit was un-American, immoral, and a threat to the health of every Californian.
Here's what's so insane is that neither one of their systems is they both have security holes. I mean, why is Issa comfortable with the no-ink electronic poll books that failed throughout LA County connecting to the internet? What's going on with that? By the way, no-ink was founded by a former Republican election official from St. Louis. And those poll books have had problems in many places, not just Los Angeles County.
But his lawsuit, what I just read, he wasn't challenging it on the security.
I know, that's what I'm saying. Why is he okay with that? That's what kills me sometimes is, everyone who's suddenly concerned about vote by mail, well, there are massive problems, including you're connecting stuff to the internet at polling places. Why are you okay with that and not okay with the other?
Well, just as a lawyer, he's trying to say that this is a different thing, causing him to have a different electoral strategy.
His strategy was to use the internet-connected electronic poll books, maybe. I don't know.
Well, look, we know that Republicans, and John is an anomaly here, but we know that Republicans are against vote by mail because look at Trump. He's going around saying that, he thinks it's going to favor Democrats. So
Exactly. Well, one thing I think about that is I'm very concerned that they had something planned with polling place equipment. I mean, the best thing is if you're a Democrat, and I am, yeah, I like that Trump hates it because I don't trust him at all, and I think he would like probably to have some help. And so if he feels that vote by mail isn't going to give him that help, then yeah. But if we're talking, there are pros and cons to each. We don't take the security holes in either one seriously. And what kills me, I'm going to do it both sides a little bit here. Both sides pretend that one way or the other is like this magic secure system. And we need to just be realistic and say there's no such thing as a perfect voting system. Let's look at the security holes in each and address them to the extent we can.
Well, every election protection advocate I work with talks about hand-marked paper ballots, hand-counted in the precincts, and that's what.
Oh, right. Well, that's what yes, but a lot of the polling places don't have that.
I read an article yesterday that somebody has suggested, and people are liking this idea, that schools open up their auditoriums to in-person voting, because in auditoriums and gymnasiums, you can space people out more. So this idea is being seriously looked at, and I think that we're going to probably have some sort of combination of in-person voting and also vote by mail voting in November.
One of our school auditoriums was traditionally one of the polling places until the county took it over and shrunk the number of polling places from, what was it, like 16 to 2 or 3. So
yeah, you only had 4 in Beverly Hills, only 4. So anyway, I just want to let people know that my upcoming show on Wednesday is going to be with Pramila Jayapal, who is a U.S. Congresswoman and also the co-chair of the Progressive Caucus. And I want to thank my guest, Jenny. Your expertise is invaluable. I'm so glad you were able to come on the show.
Thank you so much. This was fun.